Welcome everybody to our Collier Awards Symposium. Let me welcome Sewell Chan to the stage so we can get started. Sewell.
Hi everyone, thank you. I'd like to welcome all the panelists to the stage. So that's Madeleine and Parker from The New Yorker, Pramod and Andy from the ABC News, ICIJ collaboration, and of course from the Washington Post, Jessica and Jenn. Am I getting that right? Yeah. All seated, great. So this morning's panel, how many of you were here last night for the Collier Awards, the inaugural Collier Awards? Wasn't that a wonderfully inspiring evening? I love there are many journalism awards, but this is the one that I can think of that focuses specifically on the ethical details that go into great journalism. The decisions made about what not to publish, what to publish, how to approach sources, how to have an ethic of care so that we're not promoting harm or exacerbating the harm experienced by vulnerable or victimized people that we're interviewing or talking to. And so for this panel, I wanted to go project by project. I'm gonna start, if it's okay, with the New Yorker's project. Madeleine and Parker, please raise your hands, worked for a long time on an incredible project re-examining the killings in 2005 of some unarmed Iraqi civilians in a village called Haditha. And the Marines were involved. And the case has been reported on in the past. It was 20 years ago. And yet you did something extraordinary in revealing details about it that had never been known before. For one thing, you actually filed a lot of lawsuits and got a lot of documents and photos and records that had never been released to the public. So Madeleine, my first question goes to you. You had difficult decisions to make about whether and how to publish the photos of the Haditha killings. Tell us about that decision and how you disclosed your process to listeners in your podcast.
Sure, and thanks for having us, and thanks everyone for being here. So one of the things that we did in the course of our reporting was obtain photos that were taken in the hours after 25, now we learned in our reporting, civilians were killed by US Marines in Haditha, Iraq. And the photos were really important because they showed the story that a lot of the Marines had told about what happened that day in Haditha was that this was, they thought they were shooting at insurgents, that this was a fog of war situation. And what the photos we suspected would show was something else, which was why the military was working so hard to keep them secret. And so the path to us getting the photos led directly into your question about what to do about publishing them. So we had kind of an unusual thing, or at least I've never done this before, where we actually involved the survivors of the people who were killed in our lawsuit against the US military. And so survivors signed a form that 2 survivors took house to house in Haditha saying that they wanted us to have the photos of their dead family members. And then we filed that in court as part of one of our lawsuits, the argument being we anticipated the military would argue that the survivors shouldn't have, we shouldn't release these photos because it could traumatize the survivors, because that's an argument that the government had made in the past. Anyway, so we had really the full participation of the survivors. And so then when it came time, when we got the photos, which was kind of surprising. I mean, it happened after 4 years of reporting, but still it was sort of shocking. We had about 100 or so photos, and a lot of them were very graphic, as you can imagine. And then we had this other question of, well, what do we do with these photos? Obviously, we can report on what they tell us, but are we going to publish them or not? And in that decision, what was important to us all along is that we would not publish any photos that the surviving family members didn't want us to publish, and we would only publish with the permission of the surviving family members of the people depicted in the photos. And so, so there was that consideration, and so we went to the survivors, and we, one person and his family did not want the photos published, so there are no photos of their family. Other families said, yes, this is a large killing, and so there's multiple families. And then we also decided, some of the photos, even the ones that the survivors said, okay, you could publish, were just so incredibly graphic and not really revelatory, that there were others that were also graphic, but revealed something. And so we decided ultimately to publish just 10 photos that really showed the very thing that presumably the Marine Corps didn't want the public to see, which was that these were men, women, and children killed at relatively close range, shot in the head, mothers cowering with children. I mean, you can see exactly what was happening, and almost like the moment that they died, you can tell very clearly what was going on and that they weren't posing a threat. And so, we were balancing multiple considerations. But I think that what was most important to us is that after the survivors had been through so much in the course of this and had been left in the dark, no answers, totally shut out of the process, that we didn't replicate that same thing when we did our reporting.
Did the survivors all want to, just for their own personal use, have access to the images of their deceased loved ones?
No, that really differed. So for one person, who actually was the person who didn't want them published, I think it was the most important to him to have them. He really wanted to know what happened in the final moments of his father's life.
But he didn't want them published.
Yeah.
Right.
When he saw them, because we sent them to him, he did not want them made public.
Yeah. And you respected his wishes.
Yes.
Yeah. For Parker, this project involved hundreds of Freedom of Information Act requests and several lawsuits, as Madeleine mentioned, against the military seeking records of alleged war crimes. Take us a bit behind the scenes into why you sought these records and the decision to ultimately publish a large part of what you found, and how you communicated that decision to your listeners and your audience.
Yeah. Early on, when we started poking around on this story and developed an interest in war crimes, I started looking through the internet to figure out if there was any database anywhere where anyone had published how many war crimes our soldiers, American soldiers, have committed in the recent wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and was kind of shocked to find that there was nothing. There was no aggregated place where all this data was kept, but there were plenty of accounts in sort of contemporaneous news stories of American soldiers committing atrocities. So in a classic sort of in the dark style, we always have kind of a main story and then a giant,
terrible thing Parker's having to do.
A giant, sort of overwhelming, ambitious records, transparency, and data project, and I always get stuck on that. So very early on, I'm sort of scouring the internet. I'm building this Excel spreadsheet of war crimes. And to back up for a second, the reason, we're reporting on Haditha, but we want to contextualize, going in, we knew that Haditha was a case where several Marines had shot and killed 25 civilians, and that no one had been held accountable. None of them were convicted of any sort of violent crime, even though they'd been charged with murder. I mean, it was clearly an egregious event, and we wanted to contextualize that, right? Is Haditha an outlier, or is this a symptom of a military justice system that doesn't hold anyone accountable? And we couldn't answer that question without understanding the universe of cases like Haditha and the outcomes of those cases. And so I began a 4 years long process of just scraping the internet, finding records. We discovered that following My Lai, I think in 1974, the military implemented a rule which required each of the branches to generate its own central collection of reports and investigations of war crimes. And when I discovered this, I was like, this is amazing. I'm just going to FOIA each of them and say, give me your central collection, and it'll have all the war crimes in it. And as any journalist knows, first of all, they're not going to give it to us. And if they do, it's not going to be the thing you're dreaming it will be. And, the Navy's central collection was empty. The Army and the Air Force gave us these weird Excel spreadsheets of data. And so we embarked on an enormous FOIA project. And in terms of transparency, we recorded that whole thing because it's always sort of a core part of In the Dark that the listener hears how much work it takes to interact with the bureaucracy of the government, to deal with their opacity, to explain sort of what they're withholding, and then what we're able to rest free in this whole process. And I think, the military justice system is one of the most opaque adversaries for a freedom of information reporter. And we wanted all of that to be reflected in the podcast. And then later on when we published, the findings were incredible. We ended up creating, incredible to me, we ended up publishing sort of the only known database of war crimes committed by American service members in Iraq and Afghanistan since 9/11. What we found was there's a whole universe of things that seem war crimey. What we ended up publishing was just a database, the raw data for 871 incidents that the military itself took seriously enough to investigate. And then we published sort of expanded data on the 151 perpetrators, or incidents rather, in which at least one perpetrator there was probable cause found to charge him or her with a crime or to punish them. And then the outcomes of those cases. And we dumped all the records online, and the database is searchable. And that was a really important part of our process too, just having all the raw info up there.
That's just an extraordinary public service. I'm stunned that no law firm or no research institute had kind of put that together before. That's just amazing. You mentioned My Lai, which was a notorious Vietnam War era killing of civilians. A couple of years before Haditha, there was the Abu Ghraib scandal involving the torture of Iraqi prisoners at a prison in Iraq. Did the coverage of these past atrocities inform your decisions about what to write about and what to show to the public? Has the public been desensitized to these images of mass violence?
I mean, certainly they have to some extent. I think for us, I don't want to say that the way that we dealt with the photos is the way you should deal with photos always. I think that it's just in this particular circumstance, given the primary role of the survivors in seeking the records over the course of years, it seemed appropriate. But yeah, I mean, the public has been desensitized to these images. And there's also, the military was very effective at keeping those out of the public at the time when we were still at war with Iraq. And Americans often have a pretty short memory when it comes to U.S. military intervention. And so it hits differently to have something released now, I think, about the war in Iraq, perhaps much more damaging to the Marine Corps to have it released at the time. And I'm not just saying that as my own personal opinion. We have an oral history from the then Commandant of the Marine Corps, a man named Michael Hagee, talking about that, saying that at the time what he wanted, and you hear that in the podcast, he wanted to prevent another Abu Ghraib. Yeah. That was top of mind for him, that he knew that if the press ever got these photos, it would be a disaster for the military. His phrasing.
His words, right.
Yeah.
And yet you could also argue that there's a whole new generation now of Americans who were not alive or not paying attention to the news in 2005 for whom these revelations are even more powerful. Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. I'd like now to turn our attention to Andy and Pramod. As part of a collaboration between NBC News, the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, the Arab Reporters for Investigative Journalism, and The Guardian, your team really probed the treatment and the working conditions of Amazon workers and other kind of foreign workers who were working from Nepal, recruited from Nepal to work in Saudi Arabia and other Middle Eastern countries. For Pramod, give us a quick overview of this story and how it got started and how you got involved in it.
Thank you. So I think it was in 2021. I was working on the stories that trying to find out the labor violations at the projects involved in the Qatar World Cup. So at the time, I was reaching out to different migrant workers.
So these are the labor violations involved in building the stadiums and the infrastructure for the World Cup in Qatar? Okay.
Mm-hmm. So at the time, I was reaching out to multiple workers in Qatar, and they said okay, I'm in Qatar now, but I worked in Saudi Arabia, and my friends are working in Saudi Arabia now at Amazon. So I, and since I have been doing all those stuff in the Middle East, especially in the Persian Gulf, so I was kind of naturally curious what's happening inside the Amazon warehouses, because it was fairly recent time at that time, because the Amazon was making a move in Saudi Arabia. Then I started reaching out to the workers working at Amazon. So, and I started asking, how is your experience working there? Because it's one of the biggest companies in the world, and you must have a good time, kind of casual talk, right? And they started saying no, it's not like that. We really have bad time here. So I had okay, so this is gonna be a good story then. Then I started reaching out multiple workers, especially through the Facebook, because it was really difficult, finding those workers through other channels.
It's not easy to get into Saudi. So where were you doing your reporting from?
So I was based in Nepal. So that's why I began locating all those workers via Facebook, because they have posted I work at Amazon, the photos of Amazon warehouses, all those stuff. And when I talked to a couple of workers, and these workers were the ones who eventually worked as a source for me, like finding more workers because they made referrals to their friends and all those things. But when we talk about the ethics of reporting from those kind of very sensitive issues, sensitive countries, it was really difficult to me that how to talk with them, because those were the workers who were living in the shared cramped room, and not only with the Nepalese but also with other nationalities, and they had like kind of a mistrust with the other co-workers who would live together. So, and then I would chat with them over Messenger, and they said like they were very doubtful whether they, would be able to share their stories with media, with journalists.
Doubtful because they were afraid of getting fired or hurt or.
Any kinds of consequences. They would say that if Amazon knows about it, Amazon may kick me out from the job.
And then charge me for the cost of having me work there. Just give a little bit of context to our audience. A typical worker from Nepal working for Amazon in Saudi is making how much money, and how much are they sending home?
So they earn roughly $275 per working for Amazon
Per month?
and they have to pay roughly $2,000 to get the job. So it was.
They're 9 months in debt. My math was bad before they even get started.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yes. So, and at the time, like I began talking with them separately but it was also challenging because they would work 6 days a week and more hours, 10 hours a day, roughly. And I would ask them that, so I cannot call you when you are with your friends in the room because you don't trust other people. And they were fearful that if they hear I'm talking to a journalist and if they report to Amazon or other workers, it would be, problematic to me. So I would ask them, okay, so when you are alone, just, message me and then I can call you.
So was that like during the bathroom break? Like when did they call you?
Yeah, because they had like alternate weekly off days. So they would call me on that time. And when it doesn't work out, they would go to the rooftop. And we remember talking to workers, I asked them, go to the rooftop when nobody is around. And then I would talk like that.
Wow.
And sometimes, yes, they go to bathroom and kitchen as well, but they cannot talk in the aisle of the shared accommodations because they were under CCTV surveillance. So it was really, really difficult at the time. So that's why it took really long time to interview them.
Do you think they trusted you because they knew your work, because you knew people in common, because you were Nepali, or simply because you care to ask?
I would say mostly because I'm Nepali, because I usually write for the English outlets, and those workers, they don't read the English outlets, so they don't trust. And they did not know about my work, simply because I mostly write for the English outlets. But because I was based in Nepal and I'm a Nepali, they said like, okay. So, and it was very difficult in the beginning. So it took really, really long time to gain the trust of them. So I would say we spent like equal amount of time for gaining trust and also interviewing them.
It wasn't like you're Nepali, so I'm just going to trust you right away. But you had to show, frankly, that you really cared about their story and about the living conditions there. And just to be clear, a lot of people in Nepal depend on these remittances and payments sent from workers overseas, right? So it's a big part of the economy.
Yes, because because Nepal is one of the largest labor sending countries if we look into the per capita figure, although the country is very small. And the roughly a quarter of GDP comes out from the remittance money, the money that these workers send back home from their destinations countries. So it's kind of a big part of the national economy as well. So every day, like 1,500 or 200 workers leave the country to work in the Gulf nations especially. So, and wherever they go, they have to pay. And they have to pay taking loans from the village money lenders because they cannot get the loans from the bank or any other financial institutions because they don't have any collaterals to get the money, the loan
So they've
from
taken
those
out debt to
institutions.
travel, and if they're not happy with the job, it's not like they can just quit because
Yeah.
they owe a lot of money.
Yes.
Got it. At one point, at some point, did Amazon find out about your inquiry, and did that make your reporting harder?
So I think we were in the middle of our reporting, and we reached out to Amazon. And I think that Andy can explain more about how we reached out to Amazon, because he did the most of the
That's a great
work,
segue.
yeah.
So, Andy, you interviewed Amazon beginning more than 3 months before the investigation was scheduled to be published, and you had regular phone calls with the company and its executives. Can you walk us through that process, why and how you did this, and the results of your reporting?
Sure. So first off, by the way, just to go through a little bit more about the worker injustices, if I may, there's some subtle things that you may not realize. Amazon would treat these workers as seasonal workers. So if it was a major holiday, they wouldn't get work, which meant no money. They confiscated their passports so that no worker could ever leave Amazon, despite laws to the contrary. There were workers who missed the birth of their children, missed going to funerals. So it runs deep. Now to your question, Sewell. This was, within our team, a somewhat controversial move. We had a lot of debates about it, but there are reasons why I fought really strongly that we should reach out to Amazon early. First off, there had been instances in the past where journalists had relied on a victim's account and had not gone through the extra steps to verify it. I could name instances like that, but I don't want to do that. We don't have to do that right now. But there have been notable instances of that. We wanted to make sure that that was not going to be us. The other thing was, sometimes workers might be accused, despite a lack of evidence, of having stolen from Amazon or done something untoward at Amazon. We wanted to know whether the workers that we were thinking of naming in the stories, we believed they had clean records, that there was nothing untoward about them, but we would hate to have been publishing and airing a story with these workers, and all of a sudden Amazon says, oh, Andy's a horrible worker, he stole things, don't believe him. We had every reason to trust our workers, but I wanted to know what Amazon was going to say to challenge these workers' accounts. I went to them early, and they came back to us, and I told them in general what we were doing, but not the specifics, because we were still working on that. And they came back and they said, every worker whose name you've given us, they're good workers, we would hire them back. Okay, great. Now we know that these workers are trustworthy, even from...
Did that surprise you?
That did...
Would an unethical company have been said, that guy Andy Laren, you do not believe a word he tells you?
Right. It did surprise me. But I was very straightforward, because sometimes journalists may go through the motions, but we really did want to hear what Amazon had to say. Right. And I made this clear repeatedly to the company. We're coming to you early. We know this is a complicated story. We want to hear what you have to say about this. But we also want to go through these workers. And there were also logistical things to deal with when we had to print stories, of course, but we're doing television. Yeah. And we were trying to arrange funding to go and have Pramod and 2 other people go around southern Nepal to interview workers and their families.
Who had come back from Saudi.
Correct, yeah. Who had come back. So we had logistical reasons, but the overriding concern were the ethical and journalistic reasons.
So the company verifies that these folks worked there and says that they were honest, good employees. Where does it go from there?
Sure. So as far as the interviews with Amazon, so then we continue to develop our reporting, and at this point, Pramod will be too modest about this, but I'm sure he wanted to kill me at various points. And the reasons why is that at first, Pramod had 7 or 8 workers, and we were like, no, we need more. This is really a widespread problem. We need more. And that was very difficult. Not only that, we needed all the verification for all the workers. So our colleagues at the New Yorker were talking about spreadsheets. We had spreadsheets of
pay stubs,
everything to verify the workers' accounts. We got to more than 50 workers. We clearly knew that this would be in the thousands. So we're continuing to develop this. This, of course, as we're developing it, changes what we know about Amazon and what we have on them. I was on the phone with Amazon, I would say, almost every day for 2 to 3 months before we published and aired these stories. And they wanted to know what we had, and I was very transparent. As we had things, I was telling them. I was also telling them that this is an evolving story and we're going to have more. Their response to us was, we've never had journalists, anyone, ever be as transparent as you guys are.
Yeah.
And I was explaining why we thought that that was an appropriate thing to do. And at the end of the story, right as we were about to publish, Amazon announced that they admitted wrongdoing. They set up a compensation fund for $2 million. They've since compensated about 700 workers. So they were anticipating us, but we realized they could also conceivably have scooped us, but that was a risk worth taking to make sure we got everything right. And that was important to us.
And how did the collaboration between you two go? Were there some times where you were like, Andy, you're listening to Amazon too much? Or were there times when Andy was like, Pramod, you got to go back to the workers and answer? You know, like, how did that work?
Definitely going back to the workers.
So actually, like when I started investigations, I was kind of thinking that, okay, I have like 6-7 case studies and I can go to, you know, I was not even thinking of the outlet at the time. So because I was so busy at other stories and was not, you know, putting priority on it. So, and I think it was, I don't
just
know,
another freelance
yeah,
for you.
yeah, exactly, yeah. And meanwhile, ICIJ first reached out to me, like, because I have been doing stuff in the Persian Gulf, and they were asking, can we do something in the Persian Gulf? And I was like, okay, I have this. And they were like quickly ready, because Amazon, you know, American company, and ICIJ based in the US and doing all those kind of global investigations, it was definitely a priority for ICIJ. Then we began working through ICIJ, and for ICIJ, especially for the Trafficking Inc. project, NBC News, New Yorker, Guardian US, Washington Post, our reporters for investigative reporting, all those were the partners. And this is how that collaboration happened, mainly through the ICIJ's Trafficking Inc. project, I would say. So yeah, it was very nice project, and we had a very nice feeling each other, because we eventually published that, and eventually able to hold the company accountable and making it pay some of the money for their yeah. But there are things to do more, because there are workers who haven't been paid yet.
I bet. Thank you so much. And last but not least, we turn our attention to Jenn Abelson and Jessica Contrera. For the Washington Post, they and colleagues, including some here in the audience, did a meticulous investigation of 1,800 criminal cases involving sexual misconduct by police officers, people with the badge. Starting with you, Jessica, as part of the series, you obtained, of course, hundreds of documents, videos, photos, texts, and social media messages that revealed how abusive police had preyed on children. How did you make decisions, especially given the sensitivity of all matters involving young people and sexual abuse? How did you make decisions about what information to publish, and how were those decisions communicated to your readers?
So when we started the project, not knowing how many cases we would find and sort of examining this issue, you would read little clips of stories that would say, that there was an officer and that had abused a child, but it happened sort of off duty, and now he's gone and the problem's fixed. And that was the real difference that we saw in law enforcement versus other sort of teachers or coaches, where you would recognize there was this risk and take steps to prevent it. In law enforcement, it was sort of not handled in a way that we were even accepting that this could happen. And so it was really important to us, as we gathered information about these cases, and that we were looking to see, was that narrative true? Was this something that wasn't really happening on the job? And what we found was that so many of these officers were actually using their law enforcement positions to find children. They met the victims on the job, and then in so many cases, the abuse and the grooming was actually happening while they were in uniform, while they were on duty. And so we wanted to show that, but that meant, very similar to what you guys experienced as we sought these records, so often what we heard was, well, these are, child victims, and so we can't release any of this. And so we worked in many cases really closely with these young people and their families to have them sign letters saying, no, we want you, yes, I'm the victim in this case. I want you to release this information to the Washington Post. And that brought so many just things that were awful to go through. We had in one case, 1,300 some text messages from an officer to the victim. In another case, we had actually body camera footage from the day an officer drove a 14-year-old to go to the hospital for a rape kit, and that was the day he began grooming her. And we had the video footage of his body camera and the things he was saying to her watched by another officer. And so you can see how this is happening, how another officer is standing right there, not seeing the red flags. But then, do we publish that? There's a 14-year-old girl in this footage. And so very similarly, we worked with the young women and their families to say, we remember you signed that letter, here's what we have. We think that this is really important, but we're not going to publish it unless you want us to. And what was really hard was that also meant, a lot of the cases, these things happened when these girls were 14, 15. Now they were, let's say, 18, 19, trying to move on. And so do you want to watch video footage of yourself being groomed? Was really difficult discussion, but we didn't want them to, we didn't want to make the decisions ourselves. So there were many things that we chose not to publish because they said, no, it's too much. I can't watch it. I don't want to know. I don't want anyone to see it. And other cases where the family said, show it. And that's what we did.
Wow. And as a quick follow-up, was there anyone who felt so traumatized that they just did not want to re-examine it, or were most pretty open to there being some accountability no matter how much pain they had been through, despite the pain, rather, they had been through?
When we were first starting out, we were writing letters to kids and their families all across the country, and lots did say no or didn't respond, or were going through certain things. So we really tried to focus in on the individuals who said, okay, I understand. In so many cases, just similar, there's no database of this anywhere. And so we were building this database ourselves to say this is a problem happening in every state in the country. So many of these kids felt like this had only happened to them. So once we, went back to them and sort of said, this is happening all over, and, we want to offer you this opportunity to be a part of this. We're trying to help people understand that this is happening. So many of them said yes, because they, of course, didn't want it to happen to other kids.
Now, Jenn, you interviewed a number of former officers convicted of child sexual abuse, including a police chief who's currently in prison. How did you handle those interviews, and how did you did you tell the victims or the survivors before you published that you had spoken with their abusers, and how did you grapple with those ethical issues?
Yeah, I think working with the victims was really tricky, and dealing with their abusers was also really complicated. And part of their jobs as journalists is to be able to give people closer. Sorry, guys. So part of our job as journalists is not only to give an opportunity for the victims to tell and share their stories, but we have to go confront their abusers and others who enabled them. And so I think when we started this, we knew that was going to be part of the process. I don't think Jess or I really thought we were going to have that a lot of these guys were going to want to talk to us. And surprisingly, a number of them did. And so those are really complicated interviews in particular, because even though most of the people that we're talking to, almost all of them were convicted, they had been either pled guilty or they were found guilty by a jury. They still, when talked to us, sort of denied some sort of level of responsibility and were blaming the victims. So we really had to be mindful of our role as journalists in a national platform like the Washington Post. Like, what were we going to use from these conversations that we had? And so it was really difficult. And I think the interview in prison for me personally was one of the most challenging ones of my career, because it was journalistically like a coup to get this guy who's sitting in prison to allow not just me, but a photographer and a videographer to like come into the prison. But like, what were we going to do with the words he said, which was to deny any sort of responsibility, which was to blame the victims, and to we would confront him with evidence literally to his face, showing like, he's like, I never met that girl. And then I was like, well, here she is in your bedroom. And like, he's like, oh, that is my bedroom. Like, so what do you do with that? And so we had countless conversations about how do we use this material? How do we not like provide a platform for lies? And how do we communicate it to the victims themselves? And so we had a lot of conversations, and before we published, we went through which each of the victims whose abuser talked to us, sort of we were planning to put in the story. And in several cases, sort of when we shared it, they had very different responses. Sometimes there were small things that they learned that made them feel better in some way, that they maybe the person was taking some sort of responsibility, and others, you know, it was really hard for them to hear what we were going to be putting in the paper. And it changed some of the way we presented the material. In one of our stories, the last one called The Perfect Predator, we decided to, we had presented it with pull quotes from in every section of the story. And we had some big blown up pull quotes from this police chief, but we decided that we weren't going to actually use that pull quote blown up because it was essentially giving volume to a lie that he was saying. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, being able to have these conversations amongst ourselves internally at the Post, having conversations and feedback from the survivors themselves was really important and informative, and I think allowed us to try to provide and present this journalism in the most ethical way possible that we could, you know, feel good about what we were putting out there.
And one question for both of you. You know, the police in America have gotten a lot of attention over police brutality, racial disparities in who gets policed, who gets stopped, who gets frisked. How come the issue of police and childhood sexual abuse had not gotten that much attention until your series came out?
I think it wasn't recognized as a type of misconduct because people didn't want to accept that it was happening, particularly or happening on the job, like we were saying. You know, even in places where, you know, I didn't know going into this how much access police have to kids. You know, we made a massive list in our many spreadsheets of doom of where these officers were meeting kids, and it was like pulling them over, stopping for curfew, you know, they were in all kinds of youth programs. And then so we started, of course, looking really closely at the youth programs in the schools, and even in places like where, you know, school resource officers, those officers have as much access to kids as the teachers, but they don't have to play by the same rules as the teachers. It's totally normal for officers to pull kids into their office and close the door, or to take kids in their patrol car just alone. And so that was one of the big impacts that we were able to make, was that the Justice Department had never, you know, had all this guidance for school resource officers, everything from what kind of paper supplies they should have in their office, but not a word about the risk of sexual abuse. And so they changed that guidance after our reporting.
So a question for the panel, and then I'd love to really open it up to our audience here. This is real journalism. I know that sounds cliche, but we're in a time right now where a lot of people, as Dean Baquet said last night, are claiming to be journalists, and in some cases ejecting real news organizations from seats in the White House press briefing room. I think if the average American knew the care, the attention, the precision, the method, the rigor that you all use, the ethical decision-making about not exacerbating further harm, the giving a chance, whether it's to a police chief or to an Amazon official, to give a chance to tell their side, I think people would be awfully impressed, don't you? Awfully impressed and awfully appreciative of the trust that you've earned. How do we tell that story better of the trust and the methods that American journalists, especially at the investigative level, use? And how do we re-earn trust? Because trust, I don't believe anymore, can just be asserted. Like, this ran in the Washington Post, you must trust it. I'm not even sure that was true 30 years ago, and I definitely don't think it's less true now. Same with NBC News, same with the New Yorker even, right? So it's like, how do you, just maybe quickly from each pair, how did you show your methods so that it's not don't trust us because we say so, but trust us because of the rigor and the methodology that we're using here.
Yeah, so we published with our series a piece that was almost as long as some of our stories that sort of took readers through, and we updated it throughout the series, explaining precisely how we did our reporting. First, from the very origins of it, how the story started, to who the team members were and what our expertise, to the data that we collected and presented, the partnerships that we had, and everything from how our photographer worked and we worked with the victims to present or conceal their identities. I think it was really interesting because when the story's published, we sometimes got pushback from readers because they were like seeing these girls, maybe a profile, or some chose, the girls made very different decisions, and some of them showed their face but only used initials, and so we wanted to make sure there was an opportunity for readers to understand that we took this process and this decision making really seriously, and so we wanted to communicate it transparently to the audience and continue to update and ask for feedback from readers so we could learn.
Awesome.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a healthy thing for journalists to have to show their work. I mean, if we're saying trust us, it's like, how are we any different than the government then? You know, it's like, just trust us. Like, that's ridiculous. So I think that, you know, it's long been the case, like ProPublica did this very early on of like having like detailed source notes in their stories, like an annotated version of the story. So that's always been important to me in my work and on our team and our work. We published we published hundreds, thousands of pages in the Haditha investigative file alone. We published all of the, thousands of additional pages of raw material of American war crimes. The other thing that we can do maybe more naturally in a podcast is take the listener along in the process of reporting and what that looks like, and the frustrations that, ideally the listener is sort of on a quest with us in a way, encountering the government agency that's requiring us to sue them, encountering the government agency that's playing keep away with public records. And so
we're put on hold with you.
Yeah, so the government, hopefully the listener, the idea is that they feel the same frustration that we feel, because all we are in this role is really stand-ins for the public anyway. So we should all be annoyed when our government is keeping secrets from us. And so by taking us on that journey together, we can maybe share, maybe it's in a way that like the understanding of what journalism really is or should be, which is a check on the government.
In our case, we baked in our methodology in the actual main bar, the main story. So if you were reading it, you could see the steps that we took.
You couldn't miss them.
And also we would explain why certain people would not want to go on the record, and we could explain the fear that they faced, but we could also explain the rigor that we went through to verify their account. Other people, of course, we could say this is their account and these are the names, but we could explain all of that to our readers.
Wonderful. A few questions from our audience. Yes, in the back. Do we need a microphone?
Hi, I have a question for the Post team. So often with child abuse records, the names of the victims are not included on police reports. So you guys talked about sending letters out to families. How did you even know who the children were?
It was a real mix of ways that we found it. Sometimes they had filed civil lawsuits, and so we would go through the civil attorneys who represented the families. Often it was the mother or the parent at the time because they were still minors. So the civil attorneys often provided a pathway. Sometimes we went through prosecutors in the criminal cases and explained to them the importance of their story and that we wanted, the voices to be heard. And I think Jess can probably talk briefly to sort of sometimes the roadblocks we faced where adults who were not the victims wanted to make decisions for the kids themselves. And we pushed back against that. And then just other shoe leather reporting, sort of going to various people, finding other victims through sources. So it was a real mix.
Yeah, I think it's just worth adding one thing that was really important to us is it was great when a victim had a civil attorney and a parent who's protecting them. A lot of our kids didn't have that. But what we would say to them in, what we would ask them to do often was pass on a letter from us. So that was kind of our best way to reach out to the kids directly. And what we would say is, what we've learned from sexual abuse victims is, they had their choice and agency taken away from them. And so the last thing that we want to do is continue to take choice away from them. We completely understand your concerns, but we just want to make sure it's them making the choice and that we're giving this choice back to them. And that often kind of broke through for a lot of these parents and civil attorneys who initially said no to us, because often once the kids had read our letters, they wanted to do it. And then that led to some interesting conversations for us along the way of then earning the trust of parents or attorneys and things like that.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi, thank you so much. I have a question for the New Yorker team. I'm wondering, just because of how graphic those photos were of your reporting and also how much time has passed since the murders, could you talk a little bit about how the families in Iraq reacted to the story and things that you've heard from survivors since it's come out?
Yeah. The survivors have been very grateful to have their stories told. That's really the main piece of feedback that they've expressed several times. As you hear in the podcast, many of the survivors had been trying for years to get people to care about what happened, not just what happened, but the fact that, as Parker pointed out, that no one was punished for the killings themselves. And so they were grateful. I think also that, Khalid Salman Rasif, who's a man in this story who's a lawyer, but also his family members, many of his family members were killed that day, but he's become kind of a spokesperson for all the survivors. His view is I remember texting him after the presidential election, and he was sort of asking what the feedback had been and, really wanting there to be a change in the way that the U.S. handles war crimes cases, wanting there to be a change in the way that the Marines in this case were dealt with. And me sort of telling him some news, which he kind of already knew, and he just didn't accept it. He's like, well, people should still be trying to change this, And so I think that there's still a belief on the part of some of the families that maybe some kind of justice could happen here. I think that realistically the path for that is somewhat limited. But that has been, I think, the main reaction. I mean, the survivors have always been wanting to tell their stories. I mean, we have depositions of children talking in graphic detail about the murder of their parents in a criminal investigation in which they were never even called to testify. So the issue with this case has never been the survivors' reluctance to talk. It's always been everyone else's reluctance to listen.
Final question from anyone? If not, Jenn Abelson and Jessica Contrera from the Washington Post, Parker Yesko and Madeleine Baran from the New Yorker in the Dark, Andrew Laren and Pramod Acharya from NBC News, ICIJ, Arab Reporters for Investigative Journalism, and The Guardian. Thank you all so very much.